How does a game become one of the greatest of all time? Does it need to be critically acclaimed when it comes out, or generate a dedicated fanbase over the years? Does it need to be one of the best-selling games of its system? Does it need to hold up over time, even as video games evolve and the gaming industry shifts the qualities it holds valuable? The answer isn't a simple one, and will be influenced by personal tastes, but some titles have been continuously named one of the best games ever made, and The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time is one of them. The fifth main game in the Zelda series and the first one to be developed in 3D, Ocarina of Time brought one of Nintendo's most popular franchises into an entirely new dimension. It's arguably the most famous video game of all time, and anyone who grew up during the 90s remembers the hype this game generated. It garnered universally positive reviews, with several publications giving it perfect review scores and Game of the Year awards, and it left an immeasurable impact on the Zelda series and video games as a whole, with its influence lasting long after it hit store shelves. So what made it such an important game for Zelda fans, Nintendo 64 players, and video game developers, and how did Nintendo create a legacy that's lasted for over 2 decades? That's what we're here to answer today. This is The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. At Space World 1995, Nintendo unveiled the long-awaited Ultra 64, which had recently been renamed to the Nintendo 64. One of the things Nintendo showed off during the event was a tech demo of a new Zelda game that was in the works, the first to be developed in 3D. The game, eventually subtitled Ocarina of Time, was developed by a team of over 50 people, one of the largest for a Nintendo game by that time. Legendary Nintendo game director Shigeru Miyamoto acted as the producer, with 5 directors leading different sections of the game. Kid Icarus creator Toru Osawa, who was the script director, current General Deputy Manager of Nintendo EPD Yoshiaki Koizumi, who was the 3D system director, Zelda series director Yoichi Yamada, who was the game system director, current Managing Director of SRD Toshio Iwawaki, who was the program director, and Zelda series producer Eiji Aonuma, who is an assistant director and dungeon designer. These 5 formed the core design and planning force behind Ocarina of Time, with Miyamoto stepping in to offer his own ideas and, as he is known to do, outright requests that certain features be implemented. It's no secret by now that Ocarina was developed at the same time another genre-defining and revolutionary game was being worked on by the company, Super Mario 64. And while that game came out 2.5 years before Ocarina, the two games influenced each other in many ways during development. Several staff members worked on both titles, and the teams shared ideas with each other as to what would work better for Mario 64 or Ocarina, in a process similar to the development of the original Super Mario Bros. And Legend of Zelda on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Mario 64 taught Nintendo how 3D game design should work, which became a big help in finishing other projects, Ocarina included. In fact, Mario 64 and Ocarina originally used the same engine, but Nintendo revised the engine so much for Ocarina that Miyamoto considers them to be different engines entirely. But even with Mario 64 under their belts, the developers still ran into numerous challenges thanks to technological limits and general inexperience working with 3D. Ocarina was originally developed for the Nintendo 64 disk drive, but perhaps due to the add-on's failure, it was switched to cartridge format, with a new 32MB cartridge being the largest N64 cart to date. The game was conceptualized as a first-person game that would include on-rail and shooter elements, but once the idea of child and adult Link was formed, this idea was scrapped and the team had to scramble to fit what they already had into working for either version of the character. Another challenge was that the team was unsure if they could design and develop a large world like they had in the 2D Zelda games because of how unfamiliar with the hardware they were. At one point, Ocarina was going to take place entirely inside Ganon's castle, which would act as a hub world that contained portals to different levels, exactly like Mario 64 with Peach's castle. Creating cutscenes was also a big ordeal, as the team went for a more cinematic style with story sequences. Miyamoto believed cinematic cutscenes were important for keeping the player engaged, but felt that developers of the era that used pre-rendered cutscenes were trying to make movies instead of games, and so all of Ocarina's cutscenes are rendered in real time. Complementing this was the motion capture technology, an emerging system at the time used to record character animations, with Nintendo even bringing in a professional sword fighter for combat movements. According to the directors, the last year of development went by at a much more frantic pace since the developers had conquered the technical hurdles and were coming up with new ideas more rapidly. The release date had been pushed back several times, but the directors said that this was a positive thing, as the team was passionate about improving areas of the game that needed more time to be fully fleshed out. And when release day finally came, well, I think you know what happened. Ocarina of Time launched to universal acclaim, receiving perfect scores from numerous publications and winning several Game of the Year awards for 1998, and Nintendo and Zelda fans were absolutely blown away. It was also a commercial smash hit, becoming one of the top games of the 1998 holiday season and selling 7.6 million copies worldwide during its lifetime just on the N64 version alone. Of course, this was boosted by Nintendo's heavy promotion of the game, but even after all of that, I doubt anyone could have predicted the impact it would have on games for years to come. But before we examine any of that, we need to cover the game itself. Ocarina of Time begins with a young boy who can be named anything you want, but for simplicity's sake we'll call him Link, waking up from a nightmare and meeting Navi the Fairy, who says that the Great Deku Tree has summoned him. The Deku Tree informs Link of a dark presence that threatens the land of Hyrule, and after Link cures the Deku Tree of a curse that was laid upon him, he sends the boy off on a quest to gather the spiritual stones and speak to the Princess of Hyrule, a young girl named Zelda. We begin the game in Kokiri Forest, where Link lives with the fairy children, the Kokiri, including his best friend Saria. This area acts as the tutorial section, where the player learns about the controls of the game and gets a feel for moving around. As you already know, this was critical at the time the game came out, because most back in 1998 hadn't played a game like this before, and needed an area at the beginning to let them get used to it. Even though Mario 64 was already 2 years old by this point, movement in that game is very different, with its open areas and its momentum-based platforming being more forgiving for learning how to move in 3D. Mario features quick and constant movement, where the player is rarely ever confined to one space for long. By contrast, moving around in Ocarina is slower, forcing you to make more deliberate movements in both combat and platforming sections. Link isn't very fast, and his mobility options aren't incredibly robust, so while fighting enemies or navigating difficult terrain, you need to take full advantage of every move in Link's arsenal. You can't jump on a whim, but you will jump forward if you run off a ledge, and you can make Link jump further by increasing or decreasing his speed. You also have abilities like rolling, sidestepping, and backflips, but those lock you into a specific trajectory once activated, so knowing how and when to use them becomes the key to dodging attacks and traversing the land. Besides movement, most of Link's moveset comes from items he collects along the way, with two of the most important being his sword and shield. Link can swing his sword using the B button, taking advantage of all three axes to deliver attacks that all work better in different situations. For example, Link's jump slash, while it does double damage, attacks in a slow vertical slash, so enemies moving horizontally can dodge it easily. Nintendo aspired to make the sword fighting feel more cinematic with specific influence from Shanbara films, and that's reflected in how versatile the sword fighting is compared to previous Zelda games. Link can also use his shield to block incoming attacks using the R button, as long as you can position your shield correctly. While targeting enemies, you can't move your shield at all, but outside of this, you can angle the shield to deflect attacks from specific angles. The A button is used for context-specific actions that can be triggered when Link meets certain conditions. If he's moving forward, Link will roll. If he's walking near a short ledge, he'll climb up. If he's next to a character, he'll talk to them, and so on. The icon at the top of the screen changes to reflect what Link can do, which is helpful because some actions require specific circumstances. Finally, Link can assign any of his items to one of 3 C buttons, which becomes a dedicated trigger for that item. If you have bombs on C left, for example, you'll use that button to pull out, drop, and throw bombs. The most critical action by far, and one of the standout features of Ocarina of Time, is Z targeting, or L targeting on non-N64 versions. By pressing the Z button while Navi is hovering over a target, Link will lock onto that target, and movement is now dependent on Link's position in relation to the object. It's essentially a way for the players to keep enemies and objects they're focused on in view at all times, which is a godsend in combat. The only ways the player can influence the camera outside of this is by holding Z when not near a target to focus the camera behind Link, or by going into first person view, neither of which are good at helping you see everything in the room. So having a dynamic camera system that lets players keep track of their foes was an invaluable tool, especially since this came at a time before analog control was the norm for 3D cameras. Z-targeting also solves another crucial issue in early 3D gaming: how to accurately aim items at enemies to damage them. Moving and aiming shots at the same time in 3D is a no-brainer now, but back in the N64 era, having the game take care of aiming for you was crucial for players learning how to move around simultaneously. It has shown its age, especially with flying enemies and enemies with smaller hitboxes, but the system was not only fresh and innovative at the time, but as later games would prove, it was revolutionary. 22 years later, many of these moves and abilities are second nature to players, even if they aren't familiar with Zelda. Conceptually, the base gameplay isn't too far off from how modern games play, even if it isn't as refined or polished in this form. And Kokiri Forest is the perfect place for players to learn and practice the skills that will be necessary for them to complete the game. Not only is there a dedicated area for practicing swordsmanship and Z-targeting, but there's also plenty of signs and NPCs who teach you about the game's mechanics. Kokiri Forest itself has little to no dangers, so you're able to practice your sword and movement capabilities without any fear of dying. It's only when you go to meet the Great Deku Tree that you encounter enemies, and by this point you should be familiar enough with how the sword and shield work. Inside the Deku Tree, the first dungeon ramps up the challenge by introducing more enemies and showing players how dungeon layouts work. It is a pretty easy dungeon, but it's essential in giving you practical experience with sword fighting and item usage, with the first real combat and platforming sections for people to sink their teeth into. Once we defeat the giant spider Queen Goma and receive the Kokiri's Emerald, the Deku Tree tells Link about an evil man from the desert who laid the curse upon him, and to visit the Princess of Hyrule before he succumbs to the curse and passes away. Now we're free to leave the forest, but as we do, Link says goodbye to Saria, who gives us the Fairy Ocarina before we head out. It's here where we're introduced to Hyrule Field, the game's main overworld that connects all the main parts of the world together. This was one of the first true open worlds in 3D games, and for many, it was the first sign of how massive video game levels could be. Hyrule Field is a huge and expansive place, and one without many major landmarks to help you identify where you are. In fact, most of it is empty space, with the occasional hidden grotto or Peahat scattered about, which many have complained about when looking back at this game. People say it takes too long to travel across Hyrule Field, but while I understand this complaint, I don't think it's as bad as people make it out. I absolutely agree that it's too big for its own good, and Hyrule Field could have been shrunken down and it would be better, but honestly, it doesn't take that long to get to where you need to go. When you're hunting the spiritual stones, all the locations you need to visit are in the northeast section of the map, and later in the game, you have Epona and the Warp Songs to make navigation faster. The only time it bothers me is when you first travel to Hyrule Castle, since you can't make it there before it turns to night, when the castle drawbridge is closed, without walking backwards, which somehow makes Link walk faster, but once you get the Sun Song, this is no longer an issue. So while I think the Hyrule Field is too big critique is valid, I don't consider it a problem personally. You'd think with a world this large that it'd be easy to get lost, but that's not the case at all, because the game always points you to where you need to go. The game constantly gives you directions on what your next objective is, even when that objective is already clear. The most infamous of this is Kaepora Gaebora, an owl who shows up in several places to tell Link about an upcoming area or game mechanic, as well as trap players who aren't paying attention into repeating his text. But outside of him, as well as the other cutscenes that reveal your next destination, you can use Saria's song to ask Saria for a hint on what to do, and Navi will occasionally chime in to remind you of your next destination. It feels like overkill at times, and while I understand giving new players direction, especially back in 1998 where the open world probably felt overwhelming, the amount of direction you get does feel tiring. But I've been playing this game for years, and I know the sequence of events like the back of my hand, so your mileage may vary on this. When you finally reach Hyrule Castle and make it past the guards, you talk to Princess Zelda, who believes that Ganondorf, king of the Gerudos, is planning to conquer Hyrule by taking the Triforce from the Sacred Realm. Zelda sends Link to gather the other 2 spiritual stones, with the first located in the city of the Gorons on Death Mountain. It's at this point in the game when we start getting into the meat of the story, that being the battle against the King of Evil and the quest to save Hyrule from his grasp. Link begins to meet many of the game's characters at this point, and not just the main cast like Zelda and Impa, but also the residents of Hyrule, which makes a nice change from the barren wasteland of Hyrule Field. Hyrule Castletown, Kakariko Village, Goron City, and Zora's Domain are all full of people to talk to, and while most don't say anything useful, their models and dialogue do make them at least a little distinct from each other. That's important in making Hyrule feel like a living, breathing world, a practice continued from Zelda 2, A Link to the Past, and Link's Awakening. Storytelling in video games was becoming more complex, and with narratives getting as detailed as they were, having abstract worlds like Hyrule in the original Zelda wasn't enough anymore. Ocarina's Hyrule, while it isn't the most well-designed hub world, marked a definitive shift in how video game worlds were created, demonstrating how they could be tied into the narrative and storytelling. As is suitable for an epic adventure, there's plenty of cutscenes designed to either advance the plot, add to the world building, tell the player where to go, or just provide some flavor text. This game came out during the era where developers were getting more experimental with how a story is communicated, specifically taking influence from movies to create cinematic cutscenes. Things like dynamic 3D camera movements and blocking created scenes that dazzled players back in 1998, even if they seem quaint now. You have to remember that for Nintendo fans, this was one of the first cinematic experiences they had seen in gaming. And all of these cutscenes are rendered in real time, an impressive feat that set it apart from games of its era that relied on pre-rendered cutscenes. But while the cutscenes were amazing to look at back in 1998, they've definitely lost a bit of their luster. While there is movement some of the time, most of these cutscenes consist of characters staring at Link with faces that barely change expression. That's fine for small cutscenes, but for important plot moments, it feels jarring and a consequence of the hardware and 3D animation being new. And that doesn't even cover how slow these cutscenes move, but we'll talk more about that later. So, after clearing out Dodongo's caverns for the Gorons and collecting the second spiritual stone, the game takes us over to Zora's Domain, where the Zora Princess Ruto has gone missing. She's been swallowed by the Zora's god Jabu Jabu, and Link ventures into the giant fish to rescue her. By now, the players collected a number of items, all of which provide new offensive or defensive capabilities for Link or allow him to progress through certain areas of the game. Item usage has been a Zelda series staple since its inception, and the only real innovation Ocarina brings to the item system is the increase from 1 to 3 item buttons. It may seem like a minor change, but since the inventory was the largest in the franchise up to that point, giving the player more customization in Link's loadout leads to more opportunities for creative gameplay. Everything on the item menu can be equipped to either C left, C right, or C down, and since every item only has one method of use, there isn't any complexity in using an item. All you need to do is hit the assigned button. This makes Link feel very resourceful, since at any point you have multiple methods to attack your enemies or solve puzzles, which cuts down on the amount of time you go into the menu and switch out your inventory. Many items from previous games returned, including the bow, bombs, the boomerang, the hookshot, bottles, and potions, all of which behave similarly to how they did before, with the biggest changes come from adapting them to work in a 3D space. The boomerang can now curve through the air in a 3-dimensional arc, and the bow and hookshot can now be used in first-person mode. This is critical in battle, where enemies can approach Link from various angles and you need to launch or throw items carefully. But other items can be activated at any time to perform a specific function, like Nehru's Love, which protects you from taking damage, or the Lens of Truth, which lets you see otherwise invisible objects and platforms. Perhaps the two most important items are the ocarinas, the fairy ocarina that you get from Saria, and the titular Ocarina of Time, which you retrieve from Zelda after collecting the spiritual stones. Both function the same way, allowing you to play any song that you've learned using the A and C buttons. Some songs unlock designated gates and doors, while others have specific uses like Epona's song to call the horse Epona, Saria's song to talk to Saria, and the Sun song to change the time of day instantly. Later in the game, you'll also learn warp songs that let you instantly travel to specific points on the map, which cuts down on the backtracking. But the problem with the ocarinas, as well as the majority of these items, is how limited they feel. There's a lot of items to pick up in this game, and while it perhaps makes the adventure feel more epic since you have so much equipment, it honestly feels more like the inventory is diluted. This problem occurs in two ways: items strictly needed for progression, and items that get replaced by other ones. I don't have an issue with collecting stuff purely for the sake of getting past a specific section, but when a good portion of your inventory has no practical purpose outside progression, it feels like wasted opportunity. What's the benefit of using items like the Megaton Hammer or the Light Arrows outside of instances where you need them? Neither have any special abilities and don't have any added damage to your base weapon, so they ultimately just take up space that could be reserved for something more usable. And while I can understand why they did it, the fact that some items aren't usable as either child or adult Link doesn't sit right with me, especially when they get replaced by stronger items that perform the same function. It makes sense thematically why these items are replaced. A bow and arrow is more adult than a slingshot, for example, but it's a limitation that ultimately weakens the experience of finding new items. When I get the bow in the Forest Temple, my reaction isn't, wow, a new item to try out, it's cool, now I can shoot things from a distance again. This is honestly a nitpick, I understand, and you may think it isn't that big of a deal, I just find it an unnecessary addition. Rescuing Princess Ruto from Jabu Jabu nets us the final spiritual stone, and we return to Hyrule Castle Town to meet up with Zelda, but as the weather begins turning dark, we see Zelda escaping with her servant Impa. She tosses Link the Ocarina of Time and telepathically communicates to him the Song of Time, which, along with the spiritual stones, are necessary to open the Door of Time inside the Temple of Time. Before we can head there, Link is confronted by Ganondorf, who taunts our young hero before chasing off after Zelda. Link heads to the Temple of Time and opens the giant stone door, finding the Master Sword inside, which only the Hero of Time can wield, but when he takes the sword out of its pedestal, everything goes awry. Deeming Link too young to be the hero of time, the Master Sword seals Link away for 7 years, only letting him out once he becomes an adult. To make things worse, Link opened the gates to the Sacred Realm when he pulled out the Master Sword, and since Ganondorf secretly followed him into the Temple of Time, he is now freely able to enter the Sacred Realm and take the Triforce for himself. Link wakes up in the Chamber of Sages and speaks to Rauru, the Sage of Light, who says that Ganondorf ascended the throne and Hyrule is in chaos. Rauru gives Link the Light Medallion and tells him that he must awaken the other 5 sages and receive their respective medallions in order to enter Ganon's castle and confront the King of Evil. As Link leaves, he receives a mysterious message from Sheik, apparently the last survivor of the Sheikahs, who tells Link to find the hookshot in the Kakariko graveyard and then head to the temple in Kokiri Forest. Seeing the ruined Hyrule Castle town as you leave the Temple of Time is still one of the most breathtaking moments in this game. You've just passed through the peaceful, bustling market before entering the temple, and everything seems so serene and vibrant. But after 7 years, everything's been destroyed, with re-deads all around the market, and Ganon's castle looming menacingly in the distance. It's also your first glimpse at how everything has changed in the world of Hyrule since Link was a child. Hyrule Castle Town is the most obvious example, but even when you first re-enter Kokiri Forest, the influence of Ganondorf is made clear thanks to the area being overrun with Deku Babas and Mad Deku Scrubs. This is a minor change, but it really does highlight the state of the world after being subjugated by Ganon for so long, especially since this place was completely safe 7 years ago. And seeing the Sacred Forest Meadow, a place that Saria considered her special place, infested by moblins, the most intimidating enemy so far, only cements how much different Hyrule is when Link is an adult. But this isn't just restricted to Kokiri Forest, as most of Hyrule has seen some form of change that makes life fairly miserable for its inhabitants. Death Mountain is spewing an ominous red cloud and all the Gorons have been kidnapped, Lake Hylia has been drained almost completely, and Zora's domain has frozen over with only King Zora left behind. Areas that were once full of life have been reduced to wastelands, and there are fewer characters until you start solving the issues plaguing these places. Conversely, Kakariko Village is now a prosperous community since the town is no longer under construction and the residents of Hyrule Castle Town have moved in, and for the inhabitants of Gerudo Valley, who are loyal to Ganondorf, everything seems to be business as usual. So not every corner of the world is necessarily suffering, even if the characters are more generally pessimistic if you talk to them as an adult. Most of the denizens aren't happy that Ganondorf is in charge, but they feel powerless to rebel against him because of the force he now wields. Seeing all of this right after learning about Ganondorf's rise to power gives you an incentive to help return Hyrule to its previous state. You're not just told that Ganondorf is evil and must be stopped, you see what he's been doing to people for years since the Hero of Time was unable to oppose him, and now that Link is ready and able to fight, it establishes the necessity of the objective in the player's mind. After infiltrating the Forest Temple and defeating Ganondorf's Phantom, Link discovers that Saria is the Sage of Forest, although curiously, she and the other Kokiri children haven't aged, while Link definitely has. Saria passes on the Forest Medallion and Link winds up in front of the Deku Tree Sprout, who reveals that Link is not a Kokiri, but a Hylian whose dying mother left him with the Kokiri after fleeing the Hyrulean Civil War. He was raised as a Kokiri as peace reigned across the land, but as Ganondorf came closer to enacting his takeover, the Deku Tree sent Link off on his destiny to become the Hero of Time. And he continues on that quest, traveling to Death Mountain to help free the captured Gorons from their imprisonment in the Fire Temple, as well as helping to stop the dragon Volvagia from causing Death Mountain to erupt. During the child and adult sections, the game structure follows a similar path: gather everything you need around Hyrule, conquer a specific region's dungeon, then rinse and repeat. Child dungeons reward you with a spiritual stone, and adult dungeons give you a sage medallion as well as awakening another of the sages. Having these as your main objectives gives the dungeons a sense of importance, a final challenge before you get your hands on a MacGuffin. They're also the highlight of the game by a long shot, and the area of Ocarina that's aged the best in my opinion. Ocarina's dungeons continue the same room-by-room formula established in previous Zelda games and bring many design principles into 3D while also adding in new twists that take advantage of the new perspective. Your tasks are still to find the dungeon's item, then use it to defeat the boss, but the way the dungeons are constructed has changed a little bit. With the 2D games, dungeons were designed in a grid-based structure thanks to limitations of the systems, in particular the camera, which restricted field of view to a portion of the area. This meant that dungeons had to be designed to draw attention towards important areas of the maps with unique set pieces and room layouts. That's true for Ocarina as well, but thanks to the ability to manipulate the camera in 3D space, the rooms form more of an identity for themselves. Some rooms retain the same square box feel as before, but others are either expansive with wide open spaces or feature unique geometry that gives the dungeons a unique sense of scale. Of particular note is how the game handles height, as Link moving up and down to new floors by climbing up stairs, scaling a wall, or riding an elevator are more of a spectacle compared to previous games. The dungeons are also where Ocarina's puzzle elements are on full display, with most rooms requiring you to complete a goal before you can proceed. Some objectives span through the entire dungeon, such as carrying Ruto in Jabu Jabu's belly or changing the water levels in the Water Temple. Not all of these segments are fun, but on a conceptual level, Nintendo designed puzzles that squeeze every bit of juice out of their themes. And on that subject, the dungeons are still top-notch on a visual level. I'll go more in depth on Ocarina's aesthetics later, but just looking at the dungeons, they all stand out in the theming and graphical department. Given that they take place inside a physical landmark, such as a volcano, a crypt, or a statue in the desert, the dungeons emphasize darker lighting and less vibrant-looking areas that still manage to stick out from each other. Color choice is a big factor, as the color palettes both reflect the theme of the location and help set them all apart. But if I had to complain about the dungeons in some regard, I don't really like how the adult dungeons all follow a similar naming convention: Forest Temple, Fire Temple, Water Temple, etc. The child dungeons all have unique names that distance themselves from the grass level, fire level, water level dynamic, and as a result, they feel more organically integrated into the world. Even if the temples are visually and thematically distinct enough, they don't feel like they quite fit as well into this setting as the other places do. Defeating Volvagia inside the Fire Temple dispels the dark cloud coming from Death Mountain, and Link's next objective is the Water Temple located at the bottom of Lake Hylia. To do this, he travels back to Zora's domain, finding it completely frozen and abandoned save for King Zora, who is trapped in red ice. So Link must take a detour to the Ice Cavern to gather blue fire, and the Iron Boots needed to enter the next temple and free King Zora. The Ice Cavern is one of 3 mini-dungeons in the game, the others being the bottom of the well, where Link grabs the Lens of Truth, and the Gerudo Training Grounds, where Link must solve puzzles to reach the Ice Arrows. The Ice Cavern and the bottom of the well are both fairly short, with the latter lasting about 5 minutes if you only care about the main treasure, and the Gerudo Training Grounds are completely optional. But that's not the only optional quest, because Ocarina features a handful of mini-games and side quests that, as you'd expect, grant you unique rewards. The biggest of these are the 2 item collection quests to grab every heart piece and gold Skulltula token. Link starts out with only 3 hearts of health, and by collecting all the heart containers at the end of each dungeon, you can increase that to 11, but that still leaves 9 additional hearts to collect via the heart pieces, as collecting 4 of them gives you an extra heart. Some of these are lying out in the world, but most are given to you as rewards for completing a quest or minigame. Maybe it's because I've played this game for so long, but while I enjoy collecting the heart pieces, it isn't really necessary because Ocarina of Time is fairly easy overall, as potions, fairies, and magic upgrades give you more than enough in the way of defense. But Gold Skulltulas provide more of a challenge, not because they're hard to deal with, but because they're hard to find. You can't Z-target them, and they often blend into the background thanks to their dullish texture, so you need to listen for their distinctive sound to find them most of the time. Plus, they're often hidden in hard-to-reach places or only come out at night, so knowing where you need to look isn't always enough. Killing one nets you a Gold Skulltula token, of which there are 100 in the game, and collecting them helps free a cursed family in Kakariko Village. Freeing them gives you some rewards, not all of which are worth it, and a few Skulltulas are hitting way too well, but even though I know where many of them are, I still find satisfaction in finding these things. I can't say I find satisfaction in the other side quests though, in particular the Happy Mask quest and Big Goron's Sword quest. The Happy Mask shop lets you rent out masks and sell them to people who want them, and you get to pocket any additional money from the sale. All you do is find the right person and exchange the mask for rupees, and while I know everyone you need to talk to, that information isn't really communicated at all in-game, which is just frustrating. At least you're always told where to go for the Big Goron Sword quest, but that ends up just being a giant fetch quest that forces you to travel back and forth between different locations, sometimes even making it so that you can't use warp songs unless you want to start a section over again. But the Big Goron Sword you get for completing this quest is pretty great. It's a two-handed sword, meaning you can't use both it and your shield at the same time, but its power is double that of the Master Sword and it makes mincemeat of bosses, especially with a jump slash. And then there's Big Poe hunting and the fishing game, which both suck. Big Poe hunting involves riding around Hyrule Field on Epona and running through invisible triggers that spawn a Big Poe, who you need to then shoot with your bow before they disappear. Most of them are incredibly easy to get, but this one outside Kakariko Village is next to impossible because it moves in such a strange pattern. The fishing game almost feels luck-based. Sometimes the fish bite and sometimes they don't, meaning you need to leave and come back to reload the fish, which forces you to pay again. I got the top prize as a child on my first try, but as an adult it took me a whole hour to catch the biggest fish, all for a piece of heart. Ugh. Well, at least all of that stuff is optional, but one thing that's not optional is the Water Temple, which Link heads to after freeing King Zora. You've all probably heard about this temple and how terrible it is, and while I don't hate it as much as others do, this is where one of Ocarina of Time's biggest problems rears its ugly head: the pacing. People dislike the Water Temple because of its confusing and unmemorable layout, but its biggest problem, the constant need to switch back and forth between your Kokiri boots and Iron boots, is more of an extension of an underlying pacing problem. Link's arsenal is quite extensive, meaning you'll frequently be opening and closing the menu as you switch out items, and it doesn't help that menu navigation feels pretty sluggish. It takes about a second for the menu to load, and scrolling through the screens isn't very quick either. This isn't too bad for the most part, but in places like the Water Temple, where boot switching is persistent and often intrusive, opening up the menu can take a real toll on your nerves. I also find this to be a problem with the ocarinas, which are C-button items used semi-regularly as puzzle mechanics or to warp to different areas. You can always keep an ocarina on one of your C buttons, but that takes up an item slot that could be reserved for something more important or useful for combat or platforming. Other than that, Ocarina of Time is just a bit of a slog in general, even compared to other games of its era. I never look forward to pushing boxes because it takes forever, and the grid-based nature of these puzzles just makes it even worse. The game only runs at 20 frames per second, and while the frame rate is consistent, with only a few instances of areas that can lag, it doesn't look very crisp, especially now. When you combine that with Link's running speed, which isn't very fast, it leads to a game that feels like it takes longer to play than it does. That's why the Big Goron Sword quest is such a drag. It's not that it takes that long to do all of it, but that it feels like it does. And the text in Ocarina goes by at a snail's pace, which is another minor issue that becomes a major problem because of how prevalent it is. Long conversations grind the pace to a halt, even if what the characters are talking about is important or interesting. I'm used to how slow Ocarina is, but even I get annoyed by these problems, and it's certainly an area of the game that hasn't aged well. Once you've beaten the Amoeba Morpha and filled up Lake Hylia, Link heads to Kakariko Village to find it on fire, with Sheik battling an invisible monster that gains the upper hand over the two of them. Sheik tells Link that the monster, Bongo Bongo, resides in the Shadow Temple hidden behind the graveyard. However, in order to traverse the temple, Link must become a child again and enter the bottom of the well and find the Lens of Truth, allowing him to see invisible objects and defeat Bongo Bongo. The Shadow Temple is dripping in a dark, dingy atmosphere, and on that note, Ocarina has some impressive aesthetics considering the time period. Yes, the graphics are dated, but most of that is just a result of the technology it was built for being old, not because the visuals themselves are bad. The model quality is pretty good for the N64, and the environments look pretty impressive, especially since they're rendered in real time and don't feature any distance fog or frequent pop-in. Every area, especially dungeons, contains a unique atmosphere based on the textures, music, and sound design, and all those elements come together to create deep, layered moods that are very engaging. Even having played Ocarina for decades, I still get chills entering some of these areas because they're so rich in the aesthetics department. The music plays a huge part in that, with series composer Koji Kondo returning to deliver a top-notch soundtrack. Overworld and town tracks are more orchestral and lively, giving off a fairly adventurous sort of vibe. Dungeon songs are subdued and atmospheric, with slower tempos and darker melodies that are some of the best on the soundtrack. And other tracks take on an ambient style, with long sustained drones and harmonies combined with short effects and stingers. It's a varied soundtrack that does a good job balancing different musical stylings to create a memorable list of songs. My only complaint with the music is the quality of the sound font, which isn't bad considering the limitations of the N64 hardware, but hasn't aged as gracefully as the compositions, which are still excellent. Now that Kakariko Village has been saved from Bongo Bongo, Link heads over to Gerudo Valley in Western Hyrule to find the last Sage Medallion. You could barely explore this area as a kid, but as an adult, Link can infiltrate the Gerudo's fortress, where he must free carpenters who have been captured by the Gerudos, a band of thieves loyal to Ganondorf. Once he's rescued them, the Gerudos are so impressed that they make Link an honorary member and allow him to head to the Desert Colossus. This stage is home to the Spirit Temple, but you'll initially find that you can't progress beyond the entrance, at least not in this time period. When you enter as a child, Link meets Nabooru, a Gerudo who secretly opposes Ganondorf, who's looking for the Silver Gauntlets. When Link finds them for her, however, he sees Nabooru abducted by the witches Koume and Kotake, and now he can return as an adult and use the Silver Gauntlets to free her from their grasp. You're able to switch between child and adult Link by going back to the Temple of Time after you've beaten the Forest Temple, and some puzzles require you to grab items in one timeline and use them in the other one. This is an interesting idea, but for something that was pushed as a major selling point for the game, it isn't really fleshed out that much. Things you do as a child can affect the world as an adult, but there are rarely any meaningful interactions between both timelines. Instead, it's just relegated to getting past specific obstacles and setting certain flags. Even in the Spirit Temple, the child and adult sections are completely sectioned off from one another, with no direct influence from one to another. Maybe this mechanic would have been more interesting if you could switch between timelines on a whim, as that would have led to more involved puzzles that can be accomplished in real time. But since you can only change forms at the Temple of Time, I think Nintendo realized how frustrating it would be if the player were constantly forced to go back and forth between locations, so it ends up being a feature that's cool in concept, but not feeling very special. When Link frees a brainwashed Nabooru from the clutches of Koume and Kotake and awakens her as the Sage of Spirit, Rauru tells him to head back to the Temple of Time to meet with Sheik. Sheik tells Link that when Ganondorf obtained the Triforce, it split into 3 parts, with Ganondorf only receiving the Triforce of Power. Link himself holds the Triforce of Courage, and the 7th Sage holds the Triforce of Wisdom, and Sheik turns out to be Princess Zelda in disguise. Zelda bestows on Link the light arrows, but immediately afterwards she's captured in a magic barrier and taken to the Evil King's castle, and once the 6 sages use their power to open the way forward, Link heads forth to stop Ganondorf once and for all. Ganon's castle contains 6 trials themed around the sages, each of which contains a link to the barrier that blocks off the central tower. The trials don't always represent the puzzles of each of the temples, since you'll need your entire inventory to beat them, and some don't even feel like they're connected to the themes, like the forest trial featuring wind and the water trial actually based around the ice cavern. It's likely that these trials are based on earlier concepts or builds of their respective dungeons, but it means that Ganon's castle doesn't fully nail the use all the knowledge you have feeling that you expect from a final area. Once you dispel the barrier, the way to Ganon's tower opens, and inside you'll climb up multiple floors and fight some of the toughest enemies in the game before you reach Ganondorf and Zelda at the top. The fight with Ganondorf is not difficult at all, and to go on a bit of a tangent, that's a theme with the bosses in general. They look intimidating, and some of them can hurt you pretty bad if you let them, but once you know how to beat them, they put up very little challenge and go down very easily. Ganondorf is no exception, as all you need to do is bounce his energy attack back at him until he gets hit, shoot him with the light arrows, and then go into slice and dice him, all of which is easy to get a handle on. He can remove parts of the arena, and if you fall, you need to climb back up, which is annoying but overall not too challenging, and before you know it, Ganondorf has been defeated. In a fit of rage, he destroys the castle and causes it to start collapsing, and Link and Zelda make their escape before the place comes crashing down. However, Ganondorf uses the last of his strength to transform into the Beast Ganon, and after knocking the Master Sword out of Link's hands, the two engage each other in one last battle. In sharp contrast to the other bosses, the Ganon fight is incredible. The atmosphere is dark and intense, and Ganon is actually very much a threat, even if you've collected every single health upgrade like I did. None of the items you can wield as an adult do any more than 1 point of damage to Ganon except for the Master Sword, so the first part of the fight without the Master Sword is a tricky but satisfying challenge. Then, once you recover the Master Sword, it becomes a matter of turning the tide on Ganon and sending him to his knees. It's still not a super hard boss fight, but it's definitely the most difficult part of the game, which is not only fitting for a final fight, but it also gives this moment the proper climactic feeling that makes it a memorable ending. When Link deals the last strike to Ganon, the sages seal him in the Sacred Realm, and Zelda, feeling responsible for Link getting involved, uses the Ocarina of Time to send Link back to live out his childhood. Arriving at the Temple of Time as a child, Navi suddenly departs, and Link goes to inform the young Zelda of Ganondorf's plans to prevent him from ever rising to power, ending Ocarina of Time. And man, what a journey this game is. Even 22 years later, Ocarina of Time still manages to provide a solid experience, even if it is rough around the edges in some areas and has not aged well at all in others. Back in 1998, it was a graphical and auditory marvel, it delivered an epic adventure that blew other games out of the water, and it successfully brought one of Nintendo's most beloved franchises into 3D. But over time, aspects like the slow pacing, the sometimes too big level design, and the lackluster side quests do diminish the experience, and the controls and movement do feel stiff compared to modern games. Taking everything into consideration, the game has aged well enough to still be worth a look at, and even if you can't necessarily enjoy the game nowadays, I doubt you could argue just how important Ocarina of Time is. Judging it as a game was only part of the reason why I made this video, because we still need to examine what I consider the most important factor surrounding this game, and that is Ocarina of Time's legacy. Ocarina of Time didn't just become one of Nintendo's biggest hits, satisfying millions of fans and critics, but it continued to be a powerhouse in the gaming industry years after its release. Not only was it followed up with a direct sequel 2 years later with Majora's Mask, and yes, I will cover this another time, but it forever changed the landscape of gaming. The game received several re-releases, ports, and enhanced versions over the years, including 3 different versions on the N64, known as the 1.0, 1.1, and 1.2 versions, and releases on the GameCube through the Zelda's Collector Edition and the Wii and Wii U Virtual Consoles. The newer versions contain numerous bug fixes and also alter some graphics to remove potentially offensive content. More on that in a bit. Nintendo was also developing an expansion to Ocarina of Time, tentatively titled Ura Zelda, which contained remnants from when the game was being developed for the disk drive. This would eventually turn into a reworked version of Ocarina of Time called Master Quest, which was essentially the same game with dungeons redesigned to be more challenging. Master Quest was given to players as a pre-order bonus for the Wind Waker and came on a GameCube disc that also included Ocarina. I've actually never played Master Quest, so I can only judge it by looking at it, but considering it changes progression through a dungeon in addition to adding more difficult enemies, it's something I may have to do a separate video on in the future. The most essential updated version of this game though is Ocarina of Time 3D, a remake/remaster released for the Nintendo 3DS in 2011. This version was developed by Grezzo, who in addition to doing Majora's Mask 3D in 2015, also worked on the remake of Link's Awakening and the 3DS version of Luigi's Mansion. The graphics have been given an upgrade that looks very nice on console, and the game now runs at 30 FPS, which admittedly looks odd to me because I'm so used to the original's frame rate. This version also contains additions to make the game more accessible, including a hint system and gyro-based aiming that I personally don't use because it feels disorienting to me, not to mention that it makes it easier for me to accidentally disconnect my capture card. You also have a boss replay mode that tracks your best time for killing bosses, and Master Quest is unlocked after beating the game, although in this version, the entire game has been mirrored. 3D also significantly improves on the item system, having 4 item buttons instead of 3 and placing the ocarinas on their own separate button, making it less exhausting to switch out items, and that's faster now too. And even better, the Iron Boots and Hover Boots are now items that can be toggled on and off on a whim, which effectively eliminates most of the pacing issues with the Water Temple. With all these changes, plus some quality of life updates, this is absolutely the version to play if you've never played Ocarina of Time before and you want to experience it. I still think the original holds up well enough, and on a personal level, I will always gravitate towards the N64 version, but for everyone else, Ocarina of Time 3D is definitely the way to go. Moving on, when you have a game as widespread as this, especially in the early years of the internet, there are bound to be plenty of mysteries, rumors, and hoaxes surrounding it. For instance, what happened to the kid in the graveyard when you become an adult, and does the mysterious Sky Temple actually exist? Ocarina has a treasure trove of myths and secrets surrounding supposed hidden content in the game, and if you look at old fan sites and forums, you'll find plenty of posts detailing alleged ways to unlock it. Nowadays, many of these methods reek of obvious hoaxes, but this was a time before data mining was as prevalent as it is today, and verification of these discoveries was flimsy at best and non-existent at worst. It was once documented that you could beat the Running Man when he challenged you to race to Kokiri Forest, a race that you will always lose. The supposed method involved starting the race, traveling back in time, and waiting on the bridge for 7 real-life days, where Link would then change to his adult form immediately and beat the Running Man. This seems incredibly unbelievable if you think about it, and multiple sources debunked this hoax soon after it was made public. One mystery surrounding Ocarina that I find really fascinating is why Nintendo changed the music in the Fire Temple. In version 1.2 of the N64 game and all subsequent re-releases, the Fire Temple song was altered to remove a sound clip of an Islamic prayer chant and replace it with a synthesized choir. The prayer chant came from a stock sound library and has appeared in other games, most infamously in Kakuto Chojin Back Alley Brutal, which was eventually pulled from store shelves because of controversy surrounding the same sample that Nintendo used. Nintendo changed the Fire Temple music to adhere to their no religious references policy, which doesn't explain why the original symbol of the Gerudo is the Islamic star and crescent moon, but whatever. And of course, I can't talk about this game's mysteries without talking about the hunt for the Triforce. Early promotional footage of the game showed Link picking up the Triforce from a treasure chest, which many believed indicated that you could actually collect it in the final game. This led to several people spreading elaborate false methods of obtaining the Triforce, like blowing up every gossip stone to unlock a hidden song or tossing a bomb into the center of the lava pit beneath Ganon's castle. None of these rumors prove to be true, as while some leftover game data suggests that the Triforce may have been collectible at one point, there is no corresponding Triforce item left in the final game. And it makes sense if you think about it. If Nintendo wanted you to grab the most recognizable item in the Zelda universe, why would they make it a huge secret with an arbitrarily large and confusing method of obtaining it? Over time, the Triforce rumors dissipated, and players focused on other content that does exist in the game, in particular, all the various glitches. It's probably well known now that Ocarina of Time has a boatload of glitches, bugs, and sequence breaks in it, some of which are minor and some of which can break the game in half. I should stress that the vast majority of these glitches require precise inputs and frame-perfect timing, and barring some exceptions, you would never come across them in normal play. We don't have time to go over every single glitch, but some of the more famous techniques include super sliding, which lets Link coast along the ground at tremendous speeds, the infinite sword glitch, which makes Link's sword hitbox active on every single frame, bomb hovering, which uses ISG to let Link hover in the air, reverse bottle adventure, which lets you write items and values to your inventory by taking advantage of the game's coding for bottles, and wrong warping, which abuses how the game handles cutscenes and room transitions to let Link travel to areas he isn't supposed to, most notably the Ganondorf glitch, which warps you from Gohma's room in the Deku Tree to the tower collapse scene in Ganon's castle. All of this has given the game a second life in the Ocarina speedrunning community, which has become one of the best I've ever seen. Through years of discoveries, optimizations, and dedication, the community has managed to break this game to its limits, to the point that speedruns have become an almost entirely different experience. At the time of recording this video, the Any% record, which if you're unfamiliar is the fastest category that has no restrictions, currently sits at only 7 minutes and 32 seconds and is held by save state. And while the 100% category is currently undergoing some routing changes, right now the record is 3 hours, 38 minutes, and 1 second, and is held by ZFG, and just for perspective, my 100% playthrough for this video clocked in at just under 20 hours. I highly recommend you check out a speedrun just to see how different it is, because they can sometimes be so far removed from base gameplay that you'll swear it's an entirely new game. And this also applies to Master Quest, Majora's Mask, and Ocarina of Time 3D, which have their own unique tricks, techniques, and sequence breaks. Anyway, we've seen how Ocarina of Time influenced the people who played it when it came out and continue to play it to this day, but just as important is how it influenced video games going forward. Even if we just look within the Zelda series, we can see that in the years following its release, Ocarina had a massive impact on how the games in the series were designed. The commercial and critical success of Ocarina created a number of expectations for how Zelda games should be constructed, expectations that led to notable backlash whenever they weren't met. As I mentioned, the next Zelda game would be a direct sequel to Ocarina, which no doubt was a response to how well the game sold. Majora's Mask reused Ocarina's engine and featured the same protagonist, but was much darker and took place in an entirely new setting far away from Hyrule and featured less emphasis on traditional Zelda elements. This led to the game having a bit of a mixed reception when it launched, simply because it was different from Ocarina of Time, though it has since become a beloved title in its own right because of its unique qualities. Later, when The Wind Waker was announced and its cel-shaded graphics were first shown off, it also received some complaints because it went completely against the more realistic style established with Ocarina. This was compounded by Nintendo previously showing off a GameCube demonstration of Link fighting Ganondorf with a realistic style at Space World 2000, although just like Majora, Wind Waker was still a success and spawned its own sub-series that used its cartoonish aesthetics. Then, when Twilight Princess was announced in 2004 and Nintendo showed that it had gone back to a realistic style, which Shigeru Miyamoto stated was to satisfy demand, the fan response was overwhelming. Since it came out, many have described Twilight Princess as a second Ocarina of Time because of how many of the ideas conceptualized in Ocarina were copied over, and that leads to an interesting observation. The 3D Zelda series felt trapped by Ocarina's design, constantly going back to the same basic principles that Ocarina laid out as if to avoid alienating fans who adored how that game played. That's not necessarily a mark on the series' quality, and subsequent games do bring something new to the table, but it shows just how much Nintendo was worried about not repeating Ocarina's success. It wasn't until Breath of the Wild that the series broke into a new formula, and even then, its game design had been done by several games before, and those games could trace many of their principles back to Ocarina of Time. You could argue that Ocarina defined and codified the 3D action-adventure game as we know it today, as many of the game's core ideas, features, and design elements later became staples of the genre. Ocarina combined tight, responsive, and intense action with the epic storytelling of classic adventure games, and the end result would be copied and emulated for years to come. I don't mean that as a put-down of action-adventure games, but Ocarina made many of the tropes we take for granted now popular. The game helped prove that analog 360 control was not only feasible, but easy for players to understand on an instinctual level, which led to tank controls no longer being the default control scheme for 3D games. Ocarina laid down the foundation for other elements as well, including expansive worlds, narrative that permeates throughout the game, behind-the-character camera, multi-button item usage, and complex but easy-to-grasp combat. It did what Resident Evil did for survival horror, what Final Fantasy VII did for RPGs, and what the first Legend of Zelda did for 2D action-adventure games. Take qualities that had been established and bring them into 3D and build upon them for the new dimension. And that's where the true importance of Ocarina of Time lies, its role in shaping the future of one of the most popular video game genres. Even if Ocarina's status as the greatest game ever made can be debated, that doesn't erase its significance as a video game. It put down the groundwork for 3D games to improve upon what made Ocarina work so well, and while games eventually evolved beyond what Ocarina did, the impact this game had was felt for years. Maybe you didn't grow up with this game and think it looks simple and dated now, or maybe you believe it's overblown and gets too much critical praise thrown on it, and that's absolutely okay. I'm a firm believer in separating the questions of is a game good and is a game important, and while I will always defend Ocarina's legacy, whether or not the game is enjoyable is up to you. But it's that legacy that, to me, makes Ocarina a fascinating game to study, not just because of what happened in its aftermath, but because its legacy all stems from a team working with something completely new to them. The developers poured a lot of effort into designing Ocarina, and it paid off tremendously, but it wouldn't have happened without all the sparks of inspiration with what 3D games could bring to the industry as a whole. Nintendo waded through uncharted waters, but their dedication to create something remarkable led to a game that can only be described as a legend.